Hello and welcome back to the novel study of The Phantom Tollbooth. We are doing Chapter 6 today, and Chapter 6 is called Faintly Macabre's Story. So if you'll remember where we left off, we met Faintly Macabre, the not-so-wicked witch, down in the dungeons, and her job was the official witch of Dictionopolis. She told her whole story, and then she said that the only way that things will get better in Dictionopolis is the return of rhyme and reason. Now, I didn't say anything about that yesterday because that's what today's chapter is mostly about. Now, in this chapter, Faintly Macabre's story is the entire backstory of the lands beyond that we've been looking at on the map. What I'd like you to do is read along for now, and then we'll stop at the right point and we'll review what she told in the story while we're looking at the map. One other important note today, we're going to break tradition, and I am not going to read Faintly Macabre's story in the Faintly Macabre voice that I used for the last chapter, because it's a very long story, and it's a very important story. This is an important part of the book, so I'm just going to read it in my regular voice, and then we'll return to Faintly Macabre's voice at the end of the chapter. Also, a lot of your vocabulary words that you're being quizzed on this week are in this chapter, so I will make a point to mention those, but there are a ton other new vocabulary words in this chapter, so make sure that you look up on the screen as you're reading if you don't know what a word means. Okay, let's get ready to pay attention to sequence of events as we read Chapter 6, Faintly Macabre's Story. Once upon a time, this land was a barren and frightening wilderness, whose high rocky mountains sheltered the evil winds, and whose barren valleys offered hospitality to no man. Few things grew, and those that did were bent and twisted, and their fruit was as bitter as wormwood. Wormwood is actually a real plant. What wasn't waste was desert, and what wasn't desert was rock, and the demons of darkness made their home in the hills. Evil creatures roamed at will through the countryside and down to the sea. It was known as the land of Null. Then, one day, a small ship appeared on the sea of knowledge. It carried a young prince seeking the future. In the name of goodness and truth, he laid claim to all the country and set out to explore his new domain. Domain is one of your vocabulary words. It is the territory governed by a single ruler or government, a realm. The demons, monsters, and giants were furious at his presumption and banded together to drive him out. The earth shook with their battle, and when they had finished, all that remained to the prince was a small piece of land at the edge of the sea. "I'll build my city here," he declared, and that is what he did. Before long, more ships came bearing settlers for the new land, and the city grew and pushed its boundaries farther and farther out. Each day it was attacked anew, but nothing could destroy the prince's new city. And grow it did. Soon it was no longer just a city, it was a kingdom, and it was called the Kingdom of Wisdom. But outside the walls, all was not safe, and the new king vowed to conquer the land that was rightfully his. So each spring he set forth with his army, and each autumn he returned, and year by year the kingdom grew larger and more prosperous, which is also one of your vocabulary words that means having financial success or good fortune, flourishing, or successful. He took himself a wife, and before long had 2 fine young sons, to whom he taught everything he knew, so that one day they might rule wisely. When the boys grew to young manhood, the king called them to him and said, "I am becoming an old man, and can no longer go forth to battle. You must take my place and found new cities in the wilderness, for the kingdom of wisdom must grow." And so they did. One went south to the foothills of confusion and built Dictionopolis, the city of words, and one went north to the mountains of ignorance and built Digitopolis, the city of numbers. Both cities flourished mightily, and the demons were driven back still further. Soon other cities and towns were founded in the new lands, and at last only the farthest reaches of the wilderness remained to these terrible creatures. And there they waited, ready to strike down all who ventured near or relaxed their guard. The two brothers were glad, however, to go their separate ways, for they were by nature very suspicious, one of your vocabulary words, tending to believe to be guilty with little or no proof, and jealous. Each one tried to outdo the other, and they worked so hard and diligently at it that before long their cities rivaled even wisdom in size and grandeur. "Words are more important than wisdom," said one privately. "Numbers are more important than wisdom," thought the other to himself. And they grew to dislike each other more and more. The old king, however, who knew nothing of his son's animosity, one of your vocabulary words, animosity is a feeling of strong dislike, was very happy in the twilight of his reign and spent his days quietly walking and contemplating in the royal gardens. His only regret was that he'd never had a daughter, for he loved little girls as much as he loved little boys. One day, as he was strolling peacefully about the grounds, he discovered two tiny babies that had been abandoned in a basket under the grape arbor. They were beautiful, golden-haired girls. The king was overjoyed. "They have been sent to crown my old age," he cried, and called the queen, his ministers, the palace staff, and indeed the entire population to see them. "We'll call this one Rhyme and this one Reason," he said, and so they became the Princess of Sweet Rhyme and the Princess of Pure Reason, and were brought up in the palace. When the old king finally died, the kingdom was divided between his two sons, with the provision that they would be equally responsible for the welfare of the young princesses. One son went south and became Azaz, the unabridged king of Dictionopolis, and the other went north and became the mathemagician, ruler of Digitopolis. And, true to their words, they both provided well for the little girls, who continued to live in wisdom. Okay, let's take a pause. So we have this prince who sails the sea of knowledge, lands in the land of null, the land of barren, lifeless nothing, lifeless except for demons. He founds the city of wisdom, which becomes a kingdom, and then he begins to conquer all the lands around, but he really can only drive the demons back as far as the mountains of ignorance. Then he has two sons who really end up disliking each other because one loves words so much, that's Azaz, the unabridged, and the other loves numbers so much, and that's the mathemagician. Then he finds these two girls abandoned in a basket in the river, calls them Princess of Sweet Rhyme and the Princess of Pure Reason. So let's talk about what those names actually mean. Well, they come from, you guessed it, an idiom. Rhyme or reason describes whether something makes sense poetically or logically. So a song has rhyme or a poem has rhyme, and that makes a lot of sense in its own way, but it doesn't make the same kind of sense as, let's say, math, right, which is pure reason. If something happens or is done without rhyme or reason, there seems to be no logical reason for it to happen or be done. So you usually hear the idiom saying, "Oh, well, there's no rhyme or reason to what you're saying," meaning what you're saying doesn't make sense. If there's no rhyme or reason to anything, it doesn't make sense. And that's where these girls get their names. All right, let's continue to find out a little bit more about rhyme and reason. We hear that the brothers basically went their own separate ways and founded their own kingdoms, and the two little girls are still in the city of wisdom. Everyone loved the princesses because of their great beauty, their gentle ways, and their ability to settle all controversies fairly and reasonably. People with problems or grievances or arguments came from all over the land to seek advice, and even the two brothers, who by this time were fighting continuously, often called upon them to help decide matters of state. It was said by everyone that rhyme and reason answer all problems. As the years passed, the two brothers grew farther and farther apart, and their separate kingdoms became richer and grander. Their disputes, vocabulary word, arguments, however, became more and more difficult to reconcile. But always, with patience and love, the princesses set things right. Then, one day, they had the most terrible quarrel of all. King Azaz insisted that words were far more significant than numbers, and hence his kingdom was truly the greater. And the mathematician claimed that numbers were much more important than words, and hence his kingdom was supreme. They discussed and debated and raved and ranted until they were on the verge of blows, when it was decided to submit the question to arbitration by the princesses. And arbitration is when, if you can't settle an argument, then you have another person or persons, what we call a third party, listen to both sides of the argument and try and help the two parties reach an agreement. So rhyme and reason answer all problems, so the two brothers are going to take their argument to their stepsisters. After days of careful consideration, in which all the evidence was weighed and all the witnesses heard, they made their decision. Words and numbers are of equal value, for in the cloak of knowledge one is warp and the other woof. It is no more important to count the sands than it is to name the stars. Therefore, let both kingdoms live in peace. Everyone was pleased with the verdict. Everyone, that is, but the brothers, who were beside themselves with anger. What good are these girls if they cannot settle an argument in someone's favor? They growled, since both were more interested in their own advantage than in the truth. We'll banish them from the kingdom forever. And I think you know that banish means to kick somebody out. And so they were taken from the palace and sent far away to the castle in the air, and they have not been seen since. That is why today, in all this land, there is neither rhyme nor reason. All right, let's take a pause, because that's the end of Faintly Macabre's story about rhyme and reason. Now, they were banished to the castle in the air. I've been teaching this book for a number of years, and every year, students get the name of this place wrong. First of all, it is the castle in the air. Notice the C is capitalized, the A is capitalized, because it's a proper noun. Now, I have heard it called the Sky Castle, the Air Fortress, Cloud City, which is actually from Star Wars. It is called the Castle in the Air, and you need to remember that for the quiz. I'd like you to go back up to the decision that Rhyme and Reason came up with about which was greater, words or numbers. There's a very confusing line there. They say, words and numbers are of equal value, for in the cloak of knowledge, one is warp and the other woof. Well, words and numbers are of equal value makes sense. But what does that mean, one is warp and the other woof? Well, that's a term from weaving, when you weave fabrics together. And in weaving, the threads that run lengthwise are called the warp, and the threads that run across are called the woof. Basically, you can't have the warp without the woof if you're going to weave fabrics together. So what rhyme and reason are saying is that you can't have words without numbers, and you can't have numbers without words, and they're both equally important. One is not more important than the other. And that, of course, is what led the brothers to get so angry that they banished the princesses to the castle in the air. Now, this story is very important, not just because it gives us the history of the lands beyond, but because it's different than, let's say, Tock's backstory or Faintly Macabre's backstory, because this story is the actual main problem of the Phantom Tollbooth. The main problem of the book is that Rhyme and Reason are imprisoned in the castle in the air. Now, we're not done with Act 1 yet, but we have been introduced to the main problem. Okay, let's just finish one more paragraph and then we'll review that story. "And what happened to the two rulers?" asked Milo.
"Banishing the two princesses was the last thing they ever agreed upon, and they soon fell to warring with each other. Despite this, their own kingdoms have continued to prosper, but the old city of wisdom has fallen into great disrepair, and there is no one to set things right. So, you see, until the princess's return, I have to stay here."
Okay, now, so for the quiz, you're going to have to put the events of that long story in the proper sequence, and you're going to have to fill in the blanks of important names of characters and places. So let's take a moment to review very quickly the history of the lands beyond, and I've broken it down into 5 major events. What I'd like you to do is scroll up or turn back to the beginning of the book and look at the map as I tell you the events of the story up here in sequence. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at the Sea of Knowledge and going to the shores of the land of Null, or what is now the lands beyond, and just find somewhere in the middle along the shore there the City of Wisdom. Okay, so the very first thing that happens is a young prince sailed the Sea of Knowledge, landed on the shores of the land of Null, and established the City of Wisdom. First, a young prince sailed the Sea of Knowledge, landed on the shores of the land of Null, and established the City of Wisdom. Second, each spring, the prince fought back the demons, and the City of Wisdom grew, eventually becoming a kingdom. The king found himself a wife and had 2 sons who were always jealous of each other. Third, later in life, the king discovered a basket by the river with 2 baby girls inside, and he raised them as his own. Rhyme and Reason were admired for their beauty, gentleness, and ability to solve all disputes. Fourth, the old king died. His 2 sons took over rule of the kingdom. One brother went north, near the Mountains of Ignorance, and founded the city of Digitopolis. The other brother went south to the foothills of Confusion and founded the city of Dictionopolis. Before we finish the chapter, one final question, just something to think about. This prince sails the Sea of Knowledge and comes onto this land that he didn't know about, wasn't his, and even though we don't like demons and evil creatures, they were there first. And he decides that he's going to claim this land as his own and starts fighting back the demons and taking over territory to become part of his kingdom. But I want you to ask yourself, did the prince, who later became the king, did he have a right in the first place to claim those lands as his own? And this kind of connects back to history when you have colonialism, where very powerful countries who were empires would send ships and resources and men and weapons over to other lands and claim those lands as their own. Is that right? Okay, let's continue with the rest of the chapter. Maybe we can rescue them, said Milo as he saw how sad the witch looked.
Ah, that would be difficult, she replied. The castle in the air is far from here, and the one stairway which leads to it is guarded by fierce and black-hearted demons.
Tok growled ominously, for he hated even the thought of demons. Now, ominously is a very good word to know. It is one of your vocabulary words, but it's a word that shows up in all kinds of texts. It's a very commonly used vocabulary word. Something that is ominous, indicating the nature of evil or harm, foreboding or threatening.
I'm afraid there's not much a little boy and a dog can do, she said. But never you mind. It's not so bad. I've grown quite used to it here. But you must be going, or else you'll waste the whole day.
Oh, we're here for 6 million years, sighed Milo, and I don't see any way to escape.
Nonsense, scolded the witch. You mustn't take Officer Shrift so seriously. He loves to put people in prison, but he doesn't care about keeping them there. Now, just press that button in the wall and be on your way.
Milo pressed the button and a door swung open, letting in a shaft of brilliant sunshine.
Goodbye. Come again,
shouted the witch as they stepped outside and the door slammed shut. Milo and Tok stood blinking in the bright light, and as their eyes became accustomed to it, the first things they saw were the king's advisors again rushing toward them.
Ah, there you are. Where have you been? We've been looking all over for you.
The royal banquet is about to begin.
Come with us.
They seemed very agitated and out of breath as Milo walked along with them. Agitated means excited or disturbed. It's one of your vocabulary words. But what about my car? He asked. Don't need it, replied the Duke.
No use for it, said the minister.
Superfluous, advised the Count. Superfluous is also one of your vocabulary words, and it means unnecessary or needless.
Unnecessary, stated the Earl. Uncalled for,
cried the Undersecretary.
We'll take our vehicle.
Conveyance.
Rig.
Charabanc.
Chariot. Buggy.
Coach.
Brougham.
Chandridan, they repeated quickly in order, and pointed to a small wooden wagon. Now, you know the joke there is that they always talk in synonyms, so all of those words that they just said are synonyms for a type of transportation. Oh dear, all those words again, thought Milo as he climbed into the wagon with Tok and the cabinet members. How are you going to make it move? It doesn't have a...
Be very quiet, advised the Duke, for it goes without saying.
And sure enough, as soon as they were all quite still, it began to move quickly through the streets, and in a very short time they arrived at the royal palace. Now, I'd like to go back to it goes without saying, because that is an idiom. That's when something is so obvious that you don't need to say it. You just say, hey, it goes without saying. I shouldn't have to tell you that because it goes without saying. But the joke here is that it's taken literally, because when they get into the wagon, the only way to make the wagon go is to not speak. The wagon goes without saying. Thank you very much for sticking through a complicated chapter. And in the next chapter, we're going to meet King Azaz the Unabridged at the royal palace. Take care.